So human culture is replete with artifacts that interact with the senses to add beauty to the world. And for the sense of vision, we have painting, sculpture, film, architecture, typography, clothing. For the auditory sense, we have music, poetry, theater, speech, ringtones, games. Then sometimes the gustatory sense and the olfactory sense, that is the sense of taste and the sense of smell, have material artifacts that produce sensations in those as well. So food, beer, wine, cosmetics, perfume. And then for the sense of touch, we have a few different types of material artifacts that interact with the sense of touch. You have Braille, which is a system of writing that is read using a tactile engagement, and this is used in particular by blind individuals to essentially read. And then we have games, e-textiles, so things that are designed to add kind of a tactile beauty to the world. Robotics need the sense of touch. And then I put this example in here because these examples are not necessarily the most, I would argue that at least games, e-textiles, and robotics maybe not as well developed as some of the other material artifacts that interact with the other senses. So one of the inspirations for this work is something that Aldous Huxley in his book Brave New World called the feelies. So back then movies were new. So when you put so what Huxley described in Brave New World was if you put your hands on these globes that go where the cup holders are now, that they would allow you to feel what the characters on the screen are feeling. And so I would argue that materials chemistry and touch are potentially a route to medical training, new types of remote care, and perhaps even the tactile arts. And the underlying hypothesis for our work and why we are interested in this work from the standpoint of organic materials engineering is that organic media already mediate essentially all tactile interaction with any object in any environment. So even with my phone here, although it's nominally a glass surface, it's coated with a fluorinated alkyl oligomer that allows your fingers to slide around on it without smudging the surface. If you look at the paint covering the wall, that's organic. If you look at a nominally abiotic surface like a rock in the desert, it's coated with microorganisms and adventitiously adsorbed organic media. So if we are going to control the sense of touch from in a way to recapitulate natural sensations using artificial materials, then we better be able to control materials on the molecular scale, and particularly organic media. So there are many great researchers in this area doing work that has really inspired us. Some of that work has been done by Ed Colgate, who at Northwestern University, who works in the area of surface haptics, so electroadhesion, electrovibratory effects that are integratable with tablet and laptop computers. I'm going to highlight some of my friend Tanya Morimoto's work at UC San Diego, who studies the use of haptics for soft robotic actuators in surgical settings. There's a great review article by Jan Vissel at fellow UC campus, UC Santa Barbara, and he and at the time his trainee Shantanu Biswas wrote this great article on material technologies for haptics. I'd also like to highlight some of the work from the mechanical engineering community, in particular Marcy O'Malley and Dan Preston at Rice University. The first thing that we set out to understand is how humans distinguish surfaces that differ on the basis of only their surface level molecules. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic surfaces looked like a good place to start. So we took an oxidized silicon wafer and a hydrophobic silicon wafer, which is covered in a silane molecule where all of the CH bonds have been replaced with CF bonds, and we allowed participants to do what's called an odd man out test. This is a little bit like the Sesame Street game where they say one of these things is not like the other, one of these things just isn't the same, and we have the participants pick which one of the three slabs, in this case slabs of silicon, was unlike the other by touch. And we did this in two ways, one where we allowed free exploration and the other where we had tapping only, and I'll tell you why we did that in a second. So first, the results. When the slabs of material were left out on the open benchtop for the participants to engage with, most participants got well over 33%, which is the chance line, correct, so closer to 80%. Then if you immerse these substrates in water, they actually did a little bit better. And this was a little bit offensive to our intuition because in principle, by putting this in water, you're actually reducing the van der Waals force and eliminating any capillary bridges because you're putting this in water, you're eliminating capillarity as a means of interaction with the surface, and you're also, by putting this material in a high dielectric environment, you're reducing the van der Waals forces. Okay. So we don't quite know why it was easier to do in the wet condition, but it's a fodder for future research. And then in the tapping condition, this was quite interesting to us. So in, for example, many fields of psychophysics, it is the initial contact with the material and the disarticulation with the material that actually determine your ability to distinguish or to identify the material properties. For example, in audiology and musicology, when you hear a tone from a musical instrument, you're never really hearing the pure tone. You're hearing first a burr at the beginning of the tone. So for the trombone, it's like, and for the banjo, it's twang, kind of like that, and it's that and that twang sound that actually give you a lot of clues, a lot of psychological cues as to what that sound, what instrument actually produced that sound. The pure tones between instruments are actually quite difficult to distinguish from each other. Of course, they're never pure tones. You always have a harmonic overtones and so on, but even so, they're quite difficult to distinguish. So we wanted to see how much the articulation and de-articulation had to do with the ability to distinguish. So we didn't allow the participants to slide their fingers, we only allowed tapping, and they were still able to do it, although to distinguish the surfaces, although it was better, they did it better when they were allowed sliding friction. The higher the sweat constant in the content of the skin, the less good, the less accurate these participants were actually able to tell the difference between the substrates. We were very interested then in how we could use materials characterization techniques in order to understand why we were able to distinguish one surface from another. So my postdoc Charles Dong built this surface force apparatus with a silicone finger dragged across a substrate that differed on the basis of this surface chemistry, and he took these tangential friction traces at different levels of scanning velocity and downward mass, and found that at some combinations of scanning velocity and downward mass, we got identical or very well correlated tangential friction traces. So these are very well correlated. These would be very difficult to distinguish based on this scanning velocity and this downward force. And he took all of the data under all of the conditions and produced these discriminability matrices. And what this tells you is that where these squares are are green and yellow, we found that they had different friction behavior compared to when you take the oxidized versus the silanized surface. The friction behavior was different, and therefore you should be able to differentiate the surfaces. Whereas where the surfaces are, where the discriminability matrix shows red, it's actually they were very similar to the to each other, and therefore they would not be able to be distinguished. Now, human subjects have fingerprints, and so these flat fingers didn't initially have fingerprints, but when you put the fingerprints in, most of this discriminability matrix actually turns green, which means that the presence of fingerprints make surfaces that differ only by surface energy feel more different based on sliding friction. And this is the well-known stick-slip phenomenon that occurs anytime you open a creaking door or the action of a violin bow on a string. That's also stick-slip friction. The next thing we looked at was perception of softness. And softness, we had an idea that you would be able to differentiate surfaces based on softness based on your contact area that your fingertip makes with the surface, as well as indentation depth. And the problem is, if you buy a slab of material from Home Depot or the hardware store that's isotropic and unstructured, it turns out that your indentation depth and contact area is going to increase monotonically with each other. It's possible to divorce these parameters somewhat from each other by microstructuring the surface, and also that controls the contact area. So you can reduce the real contact area by putting these little air gaps in between. It's kind of equivalent to a rough or porous surface. And then you could influence the indentation depth by keeping you can influence the indentation depth by making these surfaces very thin. So if you pour, in this case, this is just PDMS, silicone rubber, into a shallow well, it will feel hard even if it's soft, because it's very thin. So if you have a very thin, soft substrate, material, but you put it on a hard substrate, it's still going to feel hard because that material can't expand outward, and so the deformation is confined. There are a couple of different ways of judging how soft these materials are. So in the first method, you can plot the aggregate percentage of the slabs that were judged soft. So in this case, the dark blue circle that has a certain amount of contact area and indentation depth, a certain amount of surface coverage with these structures, as well as a certain thickness, and this blue circle, dark blue circle, gives you is judged to be the softest most of the time. And the way that we did this experiment was the way that you do an optometry experiment. So softer 1, softer 2, softer 3, softer 4, and so on. And we did about close to 90 paired comparisons per participant. The other way to plot the data is to plot the results of the head-to-head comparison. So this plot on the left, this is overall, and this plot has a lot more data in it. This is the plot that shows the results of the head-to-head comparison. So again, we see dark blue is judged softer most of the time versus every other substrate, every other slab in the data set. And the fact that you don't have any blue in the red region and vice versa implies transitivity to the sensation of softness. So the way that we manipulated the sense of softness produces a one-dimensional number line upon which it's possible to base the engineering of a material to feel a certain level of softness. And the other things that we learned that were a little bit counterintuitive is that porous surfaces actually feel harder. This one here is a thin porous substrate, a thin porous slab, and that's the one, or I'm sorry, it's a non-porous substrate, and it's relatively thick. This one that feels hard, in contrast, this pink star, is the one that's the most porous and the thinnest. And this is true even if the spacing between asperities is greater than is greater, or I'm sorry, this is a typo. Even if the spacing between asperities is less than the spacing between afferent corpuscles in the skin. So that is, this spacing occurred on the order of 40 microns, which is smaller actually than the distance between your mechanosensory neurons that are responsible for measuring the edges of objects. And the reason for that, we believe, is that these porous surfaces produce an inhomogeneous strain field into the skin that makes them feel different, even though the lateral spacing should be too small to feel with your nerve endings the way they are. This is some unpublished work that we're pretty excited about. This is the use of materials to understand mixing of senses in the brain. So we used surfaces that differed on the basis of coolness, roughness, sharpness, tackiness, and softness. We'll just take coolness as an example. We went from polymethyl methacrylate, so just acrylic plastic here, to copper, which has quite a high thermal conductivity, and these will have different apparent coolnesses. And the question is, what is the implicit color association that our participants had with these materials? And you can see from this plot, as we increase the coolness, which is increasing the thermal conductivity, the level of blueness increased, and that comes out in the statistics here. Once you increase the roughness, that becomes more orange and brown and red and yellow, some kind of more earth-toned. Sharpness becomes more red, softness becomes more pink, and tackiness becomes more green, almost monotonically so. So those are all static materials, but my group is interested in stimulus-responsive polymers, stimulus-responsive materials in general. And so there's a material that's used all the time for neural activation called PDOT-PSS, which is a conductive polymer that contains a conductive region of PDOT plus a polyanion called polystyrene sulfonate. And the problem is with this material, so just the red part and the black part mixed together, is that those materials tend to be brittle and not very conductive unless you dope them, and they are subject to batch-to-batch variability. So our goal here was to make a more compliant material. So we co-polymerized this PSS segment with this segment, which is kind of like a bottle brush. This is polyethylene glycol, which is very well hydrated. We had the idea or the hope that it would decrease the contact impedance with the skin. This work was done by Professor Laura Kaiser, who's now a professor in the Department of Material Science and Engineering at University of Delaware. And we got some pretty cool results from this. So in this particular case, what we did was we embedded that conductive polymer in the fingertips of this glove, and we're able to apply an alternating electrical signal to it to depolarize voltage-gated ion channels in the mechanosensory neurons in the skin, so that you're basically using electronics to trigger a mechanical sensation in the skin, even though there's no actual physical deformation of the skin. We tried to confound the the participants by adding vibrotactile elements. So these are just little motors like the type that produce the vibration when your phone is on vibrate, and then thermoelectric devices, which could be either hot or cold, depending on the polarity of the voltage. So we're able to show that you could connect this instrumented glove to an instrumented robot hand, and then I'm wearing the glove here, and trust me that when this heat gun is being used on the robot hand, it's getting hot. Okay, that's fine. This work was done by Colin Keefe who's a master's student at UCSD, is now an engineer at Northrop Grumman. But then what I really want to highlight here is how this combination of actuators allows you to differentiate the material properties of what we called mystery panels in a VR experiment. So when we had two cohorts of participants, one in which the participants were trained, so that is, we applied the stimulus and we told them what it was. So we applied an intermittent electrotactile signal for rough, so and then we applied a constant electrotactile stimulus for smooth, which was just kind of a low hum, like, and then temperature, hot, cold, and then softness was judged by the frequency of the vibrotactile effect. So a high frequency for a hard tap against the surface, and low frequency for a softer material under the same tap. And so what I want to point out here is that in the trained condition, the individuals were quite good at determining the differences between the soft and hard, hot and cold, and rough and smooth surfaces. And when you did not train the participants before they went into the VR simulation, they still did pretty well. There is a little bit of ambiguity in the texture data because, but in general, we were pretty pleased with these results. What I'm showing in this plot is how we calibrated where to apply the voltage and frequency of the electrotactile signal. You don't want it to be uncomfortable, but you want to make sure that everyone can feel it. So we chose to use the tops of the error bars and the perception limit. These materials were not quite good enough for our purposes. They still, in some cases, produced some electrochemical effects. They were not the most conformable to the skin. So my postdoc, Rachel Blau, who's on the job market right now, actually made these materials where we used a much longer bottle brush segment to really increase the mechanical compliance of these materials. And we also synthesized these little extra segments of the conductive P-dot part. And the fact that this big chain here is linked by this covalent bond here, that means that you're not ever going to be able to phase separate these two structures, because this block copolymer serves as a compatibilizer between this soft segment of ethylene glycol acrylate and these relatively hard segments of P-dot. So that turned out to be a very important consideration. When we applied these materials to the skin, this is a surface electromyography setup. We just have the fingers make some kind of nondescript gestures here, and we got the best signal-to-noise ratio using our material. And we shouldn't be too surprised because we have the best combination here of conductivity, but also a pretty good strain at failure. It's actually the most conductive material, but it's stretchable about the level commensurate with what's needed for the skin. We can increase the adhesion even more so by actually chemically bonding these electrode materials directly to a metal, so that you can take what is ordinarily a decent or halfway decent neural electrode made out of a metal and kind of supercharge it by putting this conductive mixed electronic ionic soft hydrated material here to really give you a good electrochemical interface with the skin for good stimulation and neurological interfacing. And so this technique is called atom transfer radical polymerization, where you bond the initiator for this polymer directly to this gold substrate, and then you use this bromine atom here to start growing your polymer chain. What's important from these data is that, or what's important using this technique, is that the conductive material actually penetrates all the way down to the metal surface, and that means that you're retaining this three-dimensional structure of electronic and ionic conductivity on the metal, and you don't just end up with this like day-old cold pizza cheese that you could peel right off of a surface where the conductive part is just lying on top. You really need it to be interpenetrated into the surface in order to work well. And what we found is that by chemically bonding this electronic material directly to the, in this case, gold surface, we're actually able to keep it mechanically compliant for much longer, to the point where we were able to put these electrodes on the surfaces of rat cortices. So this is called the whisker barrel cortex. In order to measure the response of the rat cortex to puffs of air being administered to its whiskers. So the human somatosensory cortex, a large amount of real estate there is devoted to the senses originating from the hands and the lips. But for a rat, kind of a commensurately large amount of area is devoted not to the hands, but to the whiskers, because it gets a lot of its sensory information from the whiskers. And so the point of this work, done in collaboration with Shadi Daya and his graduate student, Samantha Russman, was that we were able to get electrocorticography readings from a rat brain that were just as good as the spin-coated or electrodeposited material, except that they lasted for much longer. We're also able to process these materials directly by laser cutting and to apply them equivalent or analogously to a temporary tattoo onto a wide variety of surfaces. And what this intimate mechanical conformability allows you to do is to administer much more precise electrotactile signals to the skin than it was otherwise possible to do. So in the field of electrotactile stimulation, which has existed for a long time in the field of haptics and transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or TENS, is that it produces kind of a nondescript electrical buzzing signal. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes, if you really crank up the power, it can evolve a gas under your skin, and you don't want that. And also, it doesn't really feel realistic. So what we did was a combination of the materials, so the materials innovation, and also and also a psychological thresholding procedure where we took the smallest noticeable current to each participant and used that as a baseline from which we used multiples of that lowest perceivable stimulation current, so that we have down here is the multiple of the stimulation current, and then this here is the frequency in hertz. And you can see that as you increase the current by factor 3, you don't really get a change in percept. But once you increase the frequency from 1 to 10 hertz, you go from predominantly a feeling of pressure to predominantly feelings of vibration. And this happens to be right where the crossover point between where the Merkel cell neurite complex is most active and where and that's a low frequency, slow adapting mechanoreceptor that's responsible for feeling the edges of objects and small deformations, to where the Meissner corpuscle is most active, right around 6 hertz and higher, and that is the mechanosensory afferent that is responsible for the sensation of fine texture and low frequency vibration. So we haven't done the microneurography to prove that that's why this crossover is happening, but it certainly seems likely. The other thing that we're able to do with this technique is enhance the contrast in 2-point discrimination tasks. So if you have control over the parameters of 2 adjacent electrodes and you apply different signals to adjacent electrodes, you can actually increase the resolution or decrease the distance at which it's possible to distinguish 2 different stimuli occurring simultaneously. It's like having 2 needles that press into the skin. You're actually able to get those needles closer if the 2 stimuli are more and more different. So that contrast improves the resolution. And the final project I'm going to tell you about is in the area of 3-dimensional haptics. So how do you project images in 3 dimensions on a skin and on the skin? And there are a couple of ways of doing this that involve speakers that move the air, and you feel those air currents as haptic stimuli. So this company Emerge that recently had entered into a partnership with Disney has this kind of like micro speaker array that produces compelling sensations, so almost like 3D holograms, but for touch. And this is kind of the similar technology is also used by Ultraleap here. But what we wanted to do was to project haptic signals from a point source, not from an array, but from one source. And so to do that, we exploited something called the photoacoustic effect, which is well known in biomedical imaging. So you send in light, you get absorption from absorbing structures in the skin and internal organs, mostly the vasculature, because hemoglobin is very good at absorbing red and IR light. And so when that light is absorbed, it quickly thermalizes, and that thermalization causes a thermoelastic expansion and pressure waves that emanate from that elastic expansion, rebound, and expansion and rebound. And so those pressure waves can be measured by an ultrasound transducer. And our idea here was to do it in the skin. And so we did a couple of different experiments here just to show that this effect was real, that we applied a 20 hertz signal to left and right hand, and these participants, they all got it 100% except for participant 4, who was a rock climber, it turned out, after we did the experiments. You could use different kinds of dyes at different wavelengths, and you can also distinguish directionality of a propagating or moving signal. Turns out, so number 4 again didn't do so well. This was the rock climber. Number 5 turns out was a rock climber, and then number 5 was a guitar player. I might have mixed those up, but you get the idea. Calluses on the fingers, reduced tactile sensitivity, not just to photoacoustics, but in general. And here is a workup of all the data, and this bottom left quadrant is the one I'd like to focus on, because this is the first choice sensation for all the participants at the fingertip. The fingertip is actually the most mechanically sensitive part of the hand, and so most of these participants felt the stimulation primarily as mechanical vibration. Some of them felt it as heat. So participant 9 here felt it mostly as heat, which is, a bit unusual in this experiment, but not unexpected, because that that thermoelastic expansion is actually mediated by heat, by the thermalization of the light. This technique works with a bunch of different laser sources, so this is mechanically chopped light from a laser. This is electrically pulsed light. And then this, I think, is the coolest result. This is actually light that is pulsed using a laptop program on a DLP slide projector. So this is just a conventional classroom, even smaller than classroom slide projector. It's not really even that powerful. We used a Fresnel lens here to condense the light on the fingertip, and we got really good detection accuracy, even with this incoherent light source. So I think this is potentially leads the way to multiple application areas, and I'd just like to leave you with the idea that chemical and molecular engineering should be a central part of research on mechanosensory perception. I pointed to the role of surface model layers in perception, new model for the parameters of softness, integration of new materials phenomena into multifunctional haptic devices, and projection haptics via photoacoustic activation of peripheral neurons. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to take a couple questions. Yeah, so the question is, what therapeutic applications have we looked at? And there are many areas in which touch and selective activation of tactile neurons could be important. So yeah, the one that let me just give you a few examples. So babies in neonatal intensive care need to be touched in order for them to develop cognitively and emotionally. That's one area. Another one we've been looking at is rehabilitation of tactile sensation from stroke survivors. Also, individuals with nerve reconstruction often have to go through tactile training to relearn how to feel things. So their neural pathways are kind of reconnected through experience of touching sandpaper and so on. And we think if we could do this in a targeted way, for example, using light or electrical stimulation, we might be able to maybe accelerate that kind of progress. I mean, these are very speculative things. We've been interested in haptics in general, in encouraging people to use wearable health interventions. So most people who get a smartwatch, especially if they're older or maybe not as technologically inclined or technologically literate, might think that the burden, the usefulness isn't worth the burden. And even doctors who are prescribing mobile health interventions find that they get maybe a day's worth of data and then the individuals don't wear it again. So haptics as a means of say, scoring at-home physical health or physical therapy interventions, or as a means of even gamification of physical therapy could be another route. Good question.